This is an LG phone, and so is this. Looks pretty crazy, right? LG's been making phones like that since 2002. But in 2021, they closed their doors forever. So what happened? Why did the phone division of such a huge tech company go out of business? If their phones were so awesome, how come nobody bought them? Well, it's complicated. And to explain, I had to dive into the inner workings of LG and the smartphone business. Let's talk about it. For those of you who don't know, LG is a Korean tech juggernaut like Samsung, known for their TVs and personal electronics. They're widely known for their screen technology, especially overseas in America and Europe. Like Samsung, they invested in the mobile phone business pretty early in the game. Back then, every phone was a lot more unique than they are now. There's no standard screen size, form factor, or shape. This led to all sorts of phone designs. They flipped, slid, and rotated. Hidden keyboards and clamshells. If you could think of it, there was a phone that existed. Every phone looked different. It was often the uniqueness of the phone design that drove sales. The cooler your phone looked, the more units you sold. These are just some of the phones that LG sold in the early 2000s. Look at how different they all are. This was especially apparent in their most popular phone from this era, the LG Chocolate in 2005. Now, if you were around at the time, you remember how crazy people went for this phone. It was towards the end of mobile phones having keyboards, right before the iPhone came out. This phone really demonstrates the pinnacle of the movement that was having a phone as a fashion piece, and this phone was huge. It was considered one of the greatest looking phones of all time, and honestly, I get it. I still want one of these. But soon after, the phone market started shifting, and LG was gonna have to change. Fast. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The release of the iPhone in 2007 changed everything. It was so revolutionary that it took every other company years to catch up. Around this time, LG released a phone that was just alright, except for its camera. It had a better camera than the iPhone, and slow-mo video. It reportedly outsold the iPhone for 5 weeks straight in the UK. That's insane. That really shows you how much of a chokehold LG had on the market before the iPhone came out, which makes their fall from grace so much crazier. LG, like every other phone company, had to make the switch to smartphones with no keyboard really quickly. An open source software called Android was developed for anybody looking to take on Apple, and LG started making Android phones alongside all of its old competitors. And this is when it started to get tough for them. It became clear pretty quickly who the big players were. The premium market was dominated by Apple and Samsung, and the budget market was dominated by Xiaomi, Oppo, and HTC. LG had a difficult time finding their footing. Their phones offered pretty good specs at a lower price than the premium, but not cheap enough to make a dent. As Slashgear put it, the end result was LG was caught in the middle, with neither the high profits of Apple and Samsung, nor the high volume of Huawei, Xiaomi, and others. Their phones were failing to find mass market appeal, despite being quite good.
LG actually did make decent phones on paper, but they did not know how to sell those phones, like, at all.
Soon, they were putting almost all of their devices on permanent sale, cutting down the price whenever demand went down.
That is the worst value retention I've ever seen.
Think about it, why would you buy a phone that's worth half the price in just a few months? They had created a brand with no customer loyalty. On top of that, they didn't really advertise their phones in the States. Prominent tech reviewers at the time said that LG seemed to have little to no marketing department. And the worst part about it, their phones weren't actually that bad. They were just fine. Nothing crazy. They had no way of standing out, but why was that? LG quickly had to find a way to get people talking about their phones, so they introduced Gimmick phones. Every new phone would introduce a crazy new feature that had never been seen on a phone before. Sometimes it would stick. For instance, LG popularized the use of ultra-wide cameras and made the first phone with laser autofocus. But almost always the Gimmick didn't stick. Just to name a few, they made a phone that was curved, one that had modular sections, and one that scanned your veins.
They also made a phone with a pop-up selfie camera and one that healed when you stabbed it. I feel like we don't talk about that enough. That's crazy.
Totally gimmicky features that looked cool on paper, but in practice they didn't work very well, and then they just ended up making the phone cost more. Each year, they would introduce a few phones with a new gimmick each, just for it to not sell well, and then they'd ditch it by the next year. Why would you buy a phone if you know they're just gonna ditch the idea the next year? That's not an attractive package for a buyer, even if you found the gimmick interesting. The worst case of this was that modular phone I told you about. When they released it, they showed this promise of, oh, there's all these modules that you can plug into the phone, and then they ended up making none of them. So you just ended up with a phone that comes apart. And that's the other thing. Due to the expense of designing these gimmicks, the rest of the phone was just not great for the price. You're paying for the gimmick and a very, very mid phone. These gimmicky phones were a couple of years behind in terms of specs, but they were priced like modern mid-rangers. Like I mentioned, all of these different gimmicks caused each phone to look really different from each other. They didn't even look like they were from the same brand. LG had no brand cohesion, and it wasn't helped by how they decided to name them. Okay, so typically when a company comes up with a phone line, they come up with a name for their phones. iPhone, Pixel, Galaxy, you get the idea. Then, what they do next is they add a number onto it to signify which one it is in their series of phones that they release every year. Google Pixel 8, iPhone 15, Samsung Galaxy S22. In cases where companies make a lot of phones every year, they'll add like a designator that's typically a letter to designate which model it is, like where in their lineup it fits. Is it high range, is it mid-range, or is it budget? For instance, Samsung, their flagship line is the S series, so the S24 is one of their best phones. Typically it's designed so it's easy to look at and figure out where each phone fits. Google Pixel 8 Pro, it's their nicest one. Google Pixel 8, it's their mid-range, and the Google Pixel 8a is their budget phone. It's imperative that the name of your product makes it easy to discern like what it's for. For Samsung, they have a lot of phones that are released every year, so the A line is their budget line and the S line is their premium line. Super easy to tell when they release a phone what it's for. Let's take a look at LG's lineup. In 2016 alone, they released the K4, the K7, the K10, the K8, the G5, the G5 SE, the K3, and the K5. Holy crap. I'm not even halfway done. In 2016, they also released the Stylus 2, the Stylus 2 Plus, the X-Cam, the X-Screen, the Stylo 2, the X-Power, the X-Style, the G-Pad X 8.0, the G-Pad X 8.0 Full HD, the X-Mach, the X-Max, the X5, and the X-Skin, along with the V20, the U, the G-Pad 3 10.1 Full HD. You look at this lineup and you have no idea what any of it is for. There's no naming scheme or structure to tell you which phones are better than other phones. You'd have to look on their website and look at the prices to figure out which one is the best. And as we discussed, those prices were never the same. You can tell how confusing this would be to be an LG fan or somebody looking into getting an LG phone. What makes it even worse is that all the phones look the same. If I saw somebody out on the street with a Google Pixel 8, I'd be like, oh, cool. A Google Pixel 8. But if I saw somebody with an LG phone, I wouldn't even be able to tell you what line it's from. But thankfully, that's as bad as it gets. Oh wait, no, it gets much worse. LG really did not support any of these numerous phones they released for more than a year. That means that pretty much all of the phones were a buggy mess. Their software was not very polished, and it kind of looked like a skin of Samsung. So let's assume that you bought an LG phone. Let's recap. You have a phone that in terms of specs isn't really that remarkable. The only saving factor to your phone is this gimmick that either wore out, is unsupported, or just doesn't work. Your phone is worth about half of what it was worth a couple of months ago when you bought it, and has a weird and complicated name that's hard for you to remember. The software is a buggy mess, and just the experience of owning this phone is nothing special. What part of that is an attractive package to customers? None of it. You can see why their business went under. There was absolutely no customer loyalty to the LG brand. Every year, less people buy LG phones, and it becomes harder and harder for them to win back customers from Samsung, Apple, or Google. There was literally nothing remarkable about these phones in terms of features that you'd use every day. So nobody buys their phones. What's next? In late 2020, LG starts looking for somebody to buy their phone division. They're citing 5.5 years of losses. It's so bad that nobody even wants to buy their business. So LG has its foot in a lot of different markets, most notably TVs and home appliances. They're making plenty of money elsewhere, so their phone business isn't actually the main focus. They've been given some time to try to get it in the green, and after 6 years of losing money, they shut it down. Their reason? Too much competition, which is technically true. They were losing customers left and right to other phone brands. Now, if you remember what I said, LG was typically the one who came up with fun new ideas that were then adopted in every other company's phones. They were the first phone with a full HD screen, the first with laser autofocus and an ultra-wide camera. Without LG, iPhone and Samsung wouldn't have these things on their phones for several more years. Sure, they weren't the best, but they were the first company to ship these ideas on actual phones, and that drives the market forward. Without LG coming up with new designs, the phone market has grown pretty stale in the last couple of years. I can guarantee that in 5 years, phones are going to look pretty much the same as they do now, and part of that is because LG left the market. We need a company to be constantly pushing the borders of what's possible, and now that LG's gone, we don't really have that. So, here's to LG. Party on, dudes.